Other is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society. From messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture, Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksiv, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, Individual Collectivism.
Cameron, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm all right. We're doing well. Good to see you.
Yeah, well, we're gonna welcome you back, and for any viewers that are gonna watch this episode, there's a certain cadence. Regular viewers are going to see that we go through an introductory phase, introducing our guests and talking a little bit about their backgrounds, and we did that with Cameron in the first episode, and we learned a few things about Cameron, including one particular thing that he benefited from homeschooling. And tonight's episode is about individualism and collectivism. And what Cameron's going to be doing for us tonight is synthesizing the two in a unique fashion. So before we get into that, I'd like you to or as we ease into that sort of conversation, I'd like you to actually tell me if your homeschooling informed any of those big words of individualism and collectivism. We're not going to define them yet. I'm just wondering if they had an influence and how would you reflect on that?
I mean, yes and no. So, um, because of homeschooling, I ended up with a very not liberal arts but classical education rooted in Latin and Greek and all this type of thing. Um, and so I'm sure that definitely gives me a different perspective than a lot of people. That isn't really how we teach people anymore. Particularly in America. You find that sometimes in Europe, but very rarely in America, the liberal arts has pretty much taken over our education system. But because I grew up even in the evangelical world, I was heavily steeped in the individualistic idea from a very young age. I grew up on a steady diet of Ayn Rand. I had read her complete works by the time I was 18. Um, to which I say, "Whew, that's a trap." And I grew up in a world where um, you know the it was the individual relationship with Jesus Christ in church. It was the individual economic progress in the rest of life, and it was all about what are you doing and how are you going to accomplish this and all this type of thing, as if you were supposed to exist in this kind of void. And that was the perspective I maintained well into my 20s. I was young, talented, ambitious, and those individual messages and that Ayn Randian thought really appeals to the young, motivated, particularly men. Has a lot of appeal because it's kind of like, yes, you can do it. You have the thing. You can go out there and make a name for yourself. You can rise above your circumstances, all this type of thing, even though the data shows that is not necessarily true,
Mm.
even though a lot of people who claim, oh yeah, I worked hard and was successful. Well, you were born on third base. Both of your parents were academics. Both of your parents were professionals. Your college was paid for. And I say that as someone with that background. My undergrad was paid for. A lot of, when I wanted to start a business, I was able to get family resources to do that. I don't come from a working class background where, I'm working my first job and I'm helping my parents pay the electric bill. Far from it. Um, and so, uh, and so there, that those messages have a lot of appeal to that. The reality, on the other hand, though, is that success of individuals is deeply, deeply dependent on the society they're in, the container of their life, the container of their career, the container of the economy. There's all these things that matter. And so I had this idea well into my mid 20s, and then the great financial crisis happened, Occupy happened, and I went down there and said, oh, I need to be a part of this. And I got to see the other half of life that I hadn't seen yet. I came from a world where I went to college, I worked hard, I did both my degrees in 4.5 years. So I got my master's when I was 23. I worked in college. I had jobs. I was working in food service industry, all this type of thing. So as I was still of that attitude, like, yeah, I work hard, I get shit done, all this type of thing. Unfortunately, after 2008, there were just no jobs and no jobs and no jobs. I didn't understand what had gone wrong yet. And going down to Occupy, I found out the system hadn't been working for a lot of people for a long time. And I began to really understand how, like, if you're a regular working person and your only asset is the paycheck you get at the end of a week every 2 weeks, and that's all the money in your life, and your household is entirely dependent on that stuff and there's no other resources, the system doesn't work very well for you. And a lot of people, even at that time, usually made more money than would be any way to get them on welfare. We didn't have the Affordable Care Act yet, all this type of thing. Well, I think we just got the Affordable Care Act, but it was still being implemented, all this type of thing. And so it was very difficult. And that was a hugely eye-opening experience to me. I had never been in a major protest movement before. I met people from all sorts of different backgrounds that I would have never met on any other circumstance. And when I do the TED talk about individual collectivism, I start with a moment in 2011 when I saw a man protesting protesting the police sweeping up people in tents at Occupy Denver, and the cops hauled him out of the protest in his tent. They did not want people in tents in City Park. He put one up anyway, and they hauled him and his tent while he was inside the tent into the back of a police car. And that was one of 100 moments where I saw interactions between the public and police, how I personally was dealing with City Hall, the fire marshal, all this type of thing to try to keep the protests going. And this was a lot of new territory for me. I grew up in the suburbs where we didn't see cop cars on a regular basis unless something had gone wrong. We didn't, I'd never spent that much time around the police and the government and all this type of thing. And so we were very, leave us alone sort of people, and very different social attitudes. And that was a huge eye opener, huge eye opener. And that was the beginning of my liberalism, and that was the beginning of my realizing the system does not work for most people. It sure as hell doesn't work for working people, and the trap doors of success are open in the wrong order. And we have this system that channels money, resources, and opportunities to the top, to the already privileged, to the detriment of everybody else. And the solution is to open the trap doors in a different order. And that's when I started to learn about economics and capitalism, all this type of thing. Not right away. I actually went and worked in fashion and nightlife and magazines. I didn't really start that work until I started the Cowan show in 2013 that would one day become the Cameron Journal. And that was the beginning of my becoming much more politically and socially liberal.
Yeah, and I guess you became a systemic sympathizer, I guess would be the correct in a country that is known for its individualism. I mean, social science experiments and are when you look at the population of the United States, it is unique in the fact that it is the one nation that defines individualism more so than any other population on the planet. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and to our detriment.
To our detriment. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so
And we
um,
didn't really, that didn't really go on to steroids until the arrival of two things: the 1950s and the fear of godless communism. And that gave us the John Birch Society, the Federalist Society, and we even changed how we taught writing in MFA programs to emphasize individualism over anything that could be construed as Bolshevism, communism, collectivism, anything like that. We literally in the 1950s, in a response to the Cold War, retooled our entire society away from anything that could be construed as communism, and individualism was held up as an ideal. And you can
right,
hear
right.
it in the language. If you listen to presidential speeches before Eisenhower, you will hear words like commonwealth, the good of the nation, body politic. After Eisenhower, all that language goes away. Remember, the quote from Kennedy is, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's always you, the individual. There's no group collective in that famous quote. It's all about individuals doing things. And that was directly in a response to communism.
Very, very, very astute and interesting observation. Okay, so explain to me what your thoughts are and how you approach economics. Basically, like, well, you're not an economist, but you're very well read and educated in economics. So, can you explain to me and the audience about economics, whether it's more of a macro, whether you're a micro analyst? What are your thoughts, your background on how economics, the discipline of economics, actually describe the system?
Well, yes, one of the troubles with economics, the dismal science, is that it 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 is very bad at defining and telling us about how the world actually works. So, I don't have a background in economics academically, although I feel like after all the stuff that I've read over the last decade, I should go back to my undergrad institution and get one. For the sheer volume of stuff that I've read and stuff that I've had to learn and all this type of thing. Um, the economic models are almost always wrong. That's the first problem. Um, a lot of the economic data we rely on are lagging indicators, not forward indicators. They tell us what the economy has done, not what it will do. Um, the other thing economics doesn't necessarily take into account always is incentives. In terms of, there are certain things that people are incentivized to do, certain things they're incentivized not to do, and sometimes certain times that people are incentivized to do something so that they won't do something else. This is particularly true in things like agriculture and commodities. So, my approach to economics is I would like to see a very mid 20th century balance between capitalism with strong social safety nets. So, when a lot of people in this country hear socialism, there's usually three camps. You have the older generation that when they hear socialism, they think of the Soviet Union. You have immigrants coming from South America who hear socialism and think Venezuela. And you have a vast majority, particularly those of us in academia and the academy, who hear socialism and we think Scandinavia. Those are three very different systems.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in the American left is arguing for central planning like the Soviets had. So we can just leave that alone. Nobody, literally, you will not find an academic in this. So Slavoj Žižek made this point in his talk with Jordan Peterson. You will not find a leftist like that in American academics because in the 50s we purged them. With McCarthyism, anybody who was seriously left-wing communist in academia got fired 60 years ago, and everybody figured out if you want to have a success in that industry, don't be that. So that's the Soviet Union out. Venezuela, it isn't really socialist. In fact, Venezuela, similar to Norway, is trying to use their national resources for the actual wealth of the local people. Now, in our modern globalized system, the West, i.e. the United States, Europe, does not like that sort of thing, even though that's exactly what Norway does. That's exactly what the state of Alaska does. Alaska, they literally use oil royalties and send everyone a check once a year. Norway, they stuff it into a sovereign wealth fund for their entire country. They fund their social programs off of it. So that's kind of what Venezuela was trying to do. The problem is, because of sanctions and all this type of thing, Venezuela's economy has been absolutely laid waste to, and a lot of people have had to escape that. So we're left with the European Scandinavian model that focuses on trade unions, fair wages, proper social support, social housing, all those types of things. For a lot of people now, it is inconceivable that a nation, the United States, as wealthy as ours, does not have any of the social supports that people in other countries are familiar with. And so I think, economically speaking, and this is true of Europe, they have businesses, some of them very large, names you'd recognize: Airbus, Schlumberger, Mercedes, BMW. They still have large Fiat, Peugeot, Renault, these huge companies. They still have those things, but they also have a higher tax environment, and they have excuse me, and they have social supports for the bottom end of their population. I think a similar system in the United States could and would be highly effective. So I look at economics as you have to look at it as people first. The models lie. So you have to go out and you have to talk to people. You have to see what's going on, what's going right, what's going wrong. You have to figure out, and this is where individual collectivism comes in. You have to figure out where people are falling through the cracks. So the heart of individual collectivism is enabling individual. What?
No, let's hold off on that, because individual collectivism we're going to bring in with Wade. Okay, but we're gonna give.
All right.
We're gonna.
Well, we'll stay on economics for now. The problem with economics is that we don't actually know what people need and what people are doing. We don't know what the container is for that, because the models don't tell us any of that. Like, for example, take unemployment, for example. Unemployment will tell you how many people filed for unemployment last month and how many, was it greater or less. It will not tell you the labor force participation rate, which is the lowest it's been since the Kennedy administration. It also will not tell you about people who have quit looking for work, which numbers 10 million, about the population of greater New York City. And so the economy looks healthier, but it isn't, because you're not looking at the right numbers. And this is the problem with economics and a lot of economic models. And we have a comment from Jake Bob who says models don't lie, they're just modeled wrong. Yes, we're not looking at the right numbers. So the picture that we're looking at, economically speaking, is incredibly distorted. And so you can look at the official numbers and the stuff that they look at and say, yes, okay, everything is fine, the economy is great. And the rest of us can come along and say, well, not really, when you have a crisis among prime-aged men who are 10 million of them are missing from the workforce, 25 to 40 to 54, you are missing a huge part of your workforce. That represents trillions of dollars in GDP and purchasing power that has left the scene. And no one knows why, no one cares, and not a single politician is offering a single solution to it. And that's why you ask people and they say, oh, the economy sucks. And you go back to the numbers and say, the economy should be fantastic. It's like, yeah, that's because you're not looking at the actual lived experience of people. It's even worse when you look at incomes. People say, oh, the average, a lot of Trump people will say this, oh, the average income of people, median income in this country went up under the Trump administration. To which I say one thing: chop out the top 1% of earners. Chop out the top 1% of earners, and you find that median income was flat and went down during the Trump years, and it also drops from 72,000 to about 33,000. So much money flows to the top that it distorts the bottom 99% of wages, so that the people and the economy and the country look healthier than they actually are.
Okay.
Now imagine if we unpacked that wealth and spread it out to the bottom 99%. Now you're talking about to over 2%, 3% growth in a developed advanced economy. I mean, the concentration of wealth at the top, ironically, is costing us money.
But isn't that scary? I mean, who's gonna slaughter that pig, right? Is that like who's doing that? I mean, are we gonna just through taxation? What's the mechanism for it?
Taxation
Cameron?
would be a great place to start. Ronald Reagan in this country is held up as the ideal Republican president, fiscal conservative, blah, 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 except for the part where he raised taxes 11 times, and median tax rates, about when I was born in 1988, were 55%. In the 1950s, under Eisenhower, top-end tax rates were 95%. If you made over $500,000 per year, the government was taking most of those dollars after that. I mean, this environment we have of taxes hovering around, they're about 28% right now, of hovering around 10 or hovering around 20 to 30% is extremely unusual over the last 100 years. And what has it contributed to is money flowing to the top.
All right, in a sentence or two, can you summarize the solution in a sentence or two, and then we're going to go to a commercial break. So what would the solution be? What would the first few steps be in terms of trying to remedy that situation of inequity?
Tax incentives to move wealth towards wages, not shareholder profits.
That's even more concise. Hold on,
Transaction
everybody.
taxes, taxing, stock buybacks. That's the type of thing you want. You want that money in the economy and moving.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Hold on. We're going to do a commercial break. And when we come back to the studio, we're going to be bringing Wade Franson in and then individual collectivism. Thank you, Cameron, for that. I know I cut you off mid introduction, but it's the theme of the show. And I think it's your baby. It's something that you've come up with that is near and dear to your intellectual heart. So hold on, everybody. Here's a commercial break. When we come back, Wade Franson back in the studio. Okay, here we go.
Your story has the power to start a movement. Journalism is more than a tool for broadcasting news. It's an important way of fostering meaningful cultural relationships that create tangible change in our society. With our anthology Cultural Journalism, you can now do your part and make your mark. From expert writers to passionate amateur, everyone has a story to tell. Our aim is to promote equality, empathy, and create a safe space for different perspectives and interpretations of the world around us. Come join us today and break free from the toxic news cycle. By submitting your story to Cultural Journalism at info@soupllc.com.
Good evening, everyone.
I fixed my chair and screwed up my camera angle.
Cameron, it's been just an absolute pleasure listening to you and Dan talk from the in back of the studio. Thank you so much for coming to join us again. Last time we discussed really your personal journey, the role of religion in your life, how you found a way out of where you were at to where you are at now. Today it's individual collectivism, which we're going to ask you to unpack in a moment. And next time, it's going to be the Enlightenment and capitalism 2 weeks from now. Where did your interest come from for these deep topics, these broad topics that affect all of us and society as a whole? And I'm sure, the amount of time, reading, study, reflection, effort to be as knowledgeable as you are about this variety of topics and to understand them together, it's not just a hobby. I'm sure it's got to be a passion. Where did that come from?
For me, it was kind of out of personal necessity. In the post-Great Financial Crisis, I was trying to figure out why I and a lot of other people couldn't find a job. I would go on to write a book about that called America's Lost Generation, which will be coming out this year. And it's filled with stories of people and how they've struggled over the last 10 years. And and then I talk about the data and the numbers and the reasons and the history and the context of it all. So it is a magnum opus of all of this work. And
did that arise out of disappointment and disillusion at what you had been taught or led to believe, that then didn't end up playing out the way you thought?
Oh, absolutely. My generation was sold a very specific bill of goods that was never delivered upon. You know, we were told to not do drugs, not have sex, stay in school, get good grades, go to college, and get a great job and have success. You know, build your credit score, buy a house, all this type of thing. And for a lot of us, that for some of us, it was never a possibility. For some, it was a possibility that was stolen from them. And for many others, it's only been a possibility with a lot of family help, which was unknown to their parents. My parents did not call their parents to get a down payment for a house. Why would they have? You know, sort of thing. Whereas now, yeah, millennial home ownership's up to 52%, but I can tell you a solid third of that is parents helping their kids out to buy houses, you know, sort of thing. And so that, you know, it was me trying to figure that out, because I didn't at first, I didn't know what I had done wrong. And then I also realized I wasn't the only one. Now, I'm a bit of a unique case because I'm also autistic and ADHD. So, to be honest, I probably was never going to exist in the economy anyway. I was probably always going to end up doing this. But the powers of autism gave me the ability to see the patterns in the data, in the stories, to talk to people. I'm firstly a student of people. The bipedular hominids on this planet are fascinating. And so I used that to go understand what had happened. In America's Lost Generation, I compare what happened to millennials to the 1991 Japanese property crisis, and realize that the Japanese had done what had happened to us 15 years before. And so I started studying that intensely to understand what became of that, to kind of get an idea of what the future of millennials will be. Preview, not good.
So let's take a step back.
That's how I started.
Thank you. Let's take a step a little bit further back and say, why did it work for the parents of millennials? Why did it work for the baby boomers? What has changed, or what is changing in the ability of that American dream to deliver?
Very, very simple. The boomers were given everything. Their parents had been through the Depression and the war. They knew what deprivation was. Real deprivation. Can't feed yourself. Real deprivation. America had...
But from such deprivation and want...
Yes.
How does a generation experiencing deprivation and want achieve the ability to give everything to the next generation?
That was going to be my next point. So fortunately, the greatest generation, the World War II folks, were blessed by being the only industrialized nation at the end of World War II that hadn't been bombed into the Stone Ages. And so that gave us the opportunity to go on about a 20-year economic bull run that we will never see ever again. Ever. So just forget about that. And it gave us an opportunity to have an export surplus like none other. It gave us an opportunity to create jobs like none other, and that enabled the greatest generation to give their children every opportunity, everything that they never had. And the boomers got used to that. And the other thing is, there was so many of them. People came back from World War II, they couldn't have kids fast enough. There were so many of them that boomers were able to affect the economy and affect society simply by doing things en masse. When they decided a band was cool, that band became the hottest thing on the planet.
Right.
When they decided that, this is the way to dress, or this is the thing, that whatever have you, everything else was wiped away. Even corporate America had to cater to them.
So to simplify it,
changed America.
Yeah. So to simplify it, or perhaps oversimplify it, it was largely circumstantial. In right place, right time, booming economy.
Here's the part that wasn't, though. The economic reforms of the New Deal enabled the economic boom that is so well remembered in this country. People forget in the 50s and 60s, taxes were high. I'm talking 80, 90%. I mean, absurdly high. We had the Commerce Department controlled airline fares, trucking rates. The reforms of the New Deal made that possible.
Understood. But what I'm getting at, though, still is the reforms of the New Deal were, if what I'm hearing you say, they were smart, really good choices for the specific circumstances of the time. That's kind of what I mean by circumstantial, right?
Well, yes, that is true. Yeah.
So you had a very unique set of circumstances. I'll also go back to the fact that you had this vast, unplundered wealth of a continent with unbelievable natural resources, sort of rivers flowing in the right places through land that had, 10 feet of topsoil, right? And wildlife, and nothing built on it, nobody living on it, just there for the taking. You follow me? So, there's a lot going into it. So, and getting back to the title of this show, the role of religion in society, to help, and whether it's religion or other forces to shape the nature of the society to fit the specific unique circumstances. The specific model that worked somewhere else may not work this time in this place. I think it was before the show we were talking about different models, or maybe it was with Dan, I forget now, of socialism. You mentioned 3 different models. So we'll get into that in a minute. I'm just going to jump ahead, and I had one other question, but I'm going to just jump over it and ask you now to finally, for me and for our audience, define individual collectivism. What do you mean when you write about individual collectivism?
Yeah, the heart of individual collectivism is to incentivize individuals to do well so that society can benefit thereby, which is a very fancy way of saying when people do well, society does well, and vice versa. And you have to have both. If you're missing either side, it all falls apart.
How does that compare or relate to the concept of enlightened self-interest?
Well, enlightened self-interest is helpful to a point. But ultimately, enlightened self-interest will only get you so far if you don't have the societal infrastructure that makes it possible and practical to do so. Most people who want to do things on their own don't want to pay for their own security because there are no police, pay for their own fire because there's no fire department, pay for their own road membership because the roads are not social. I mean, most people don't want to, that adds on a lot of costs and frictions to trying to start a business, right?
You can get ahead by not buying insurance until you can't. Until you don't.
Exactly, until your building has burned down. So, yes, so that people, and that's what I think part of why we need both is that people forget individualism will only take you, in my opinion, not very far, but so far, before if you do not have the wonderful infrastructure background of other people doing other things, this sort of collective thing, that individualism really doesn't get you as far as you think it does or would or could or should. So that's why I say we really need both. And I think in the 20th century, we tried hyper-individualism in the West. We tried collectivism in the East. Neither one worked well on their own.
Right.
What's the lesson from that? We need both.
How does that relate to the African proverb? You've probably heard it. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yes, because going with a group of people who can help and do things and figure things out and be able to divide labor makes it much more sustainable to go on a very long journey. Whereas when you're going by yourself, yeah, you'll get there fast, but you're going to have to do every single thing along the way. And that, yes, it is. That is,
and you can only go so far fast before you die of exhaustion.
And humans are inherently collaborative. That's one of the reasons we've been so successful on the planet, is because we're able to group together, come up with a plan, and execute it in the way that other animals on this planet cannot. But yet, for the past 50 years, we have been told, as a society, narratively speaking, that, Ronald Reagan, I'm going to get government off your back, and I believe you can do better on your own. And that if you're a person who, wants to get ahead and see that paycheck grow or see your business grow, whatever have you, it's easy to nod along with that.
Right.
But I'll also come along and say, do you not understand your business and your success is only possible because that person is successful, that person has a job, that person can buy a house, all this type of thing. So yeah, you might pay a little bit more taxes, and that's not necessarily fun for you, but it makes your success over the long term possible.
So the first thing that I'm hearing in this, well, I'm hearing many things, but one of the important things that I'm hearing is the danger, the detriment of echo chambers that tout one side versus the other, right? And attract people to one side versus the other, creating a false dichotomy that is dishonest, essentially dishonest, but it's being sold to people for. It might be well-intentioned, it might be nefarious, but it's fundamentally dishonest, inaccurate, flawed, full of misconceptions, and it doesn't help us figure things out.
Well, yes. I mean, no one is more unhappy with our current bifurcated political environment than me. It is very disappointing that so many people get stuck in and I talk about news narratives a lot at the Cameron Journal, get stuck in one news narrative, get stuck in one side perspective, all this type of thing, when the reality is it's much more nuanced than that. However, and Adam Curtis talks about this, the world is so complicated and complex and so hard to understand. One of the ways that politicians have gotten away with how things have gone over the last 40, 45 years or so is by making everything very simple. Good, bad, yes, no, us, them, evil, good, this sort of thing, because it simplifies everything. Even in culture, why are Marvel movies popular? Because there is a good and a bad. You root for the Avengers, you don't like the villain. You like the Batman, you don't like the Joker. All this type of thing. It's simple, and it's a dichotomy. No mess. In fact, I've had people say, oh, I'm tired of anti-heroes or heroes with problems. Can't someone just be good? Because it's simple. It lacks nuance. It lacks context. It's simple and easy to understand. And this has infected every aspect of our lives.
It's interesting. It's interesting to look back, and there's studies that have been done around, like, Frankenstein. The Frankenstein monster was popular for a while, and then it was vampires. And zombies, of course, have been very, very popular for a long time, and there's a reason. But I was taking my daughter to school this morning, and it occurred to me, we were having a discussion. I said, those memes, the moment when you realize, right? I said, here's a good meme for you. The moment when you realize you're not the zombie fighter, you're the zombie. Right? And these narratives, these news cycles, they turn us into zombies. And we think we're the one fighting all the other zombies out there. Everybody else is a zombie, right? No. You're the zombie. You have been, lobotomized and turned into a creature that is lumbering in only one direction, understanding only one thing, to eat other people's brains, kind of thing.
Well, yes. I mean, that is one of the difficulties with news as a narrative rather than news as facts. And that has been something cable news did it the worst. Network news doubled down in the 90s with If It Bleed, It Leads. And we have gotten into a situation where, if you are a liberal in America, then you read this, listen to this, watch this. If you are a conservative, you read this, listen to this, watch this, and never the twain shall meet. It didn't used to be like that. And what has led to is a complete lack of any sort of shared narrative, shared destiny, shared ideas, and I have this in my own personal life of people call me on the phone and they're screaming at me in sort of apoplectic terror. Why isn't this a thing? Why isn't this being covered? Why is there media blackout? Blah blah blah. And I'm kind of like, because there's no story there, dude. But here's why your media is covering it, because it serves their narrative.
Right.
And so this is no way, in terms of news and politics, this is no way to have a democracy. Let me be clear about that. No way to have a democracy at all. Complete disaster.
So then individual collectivism, where would you point around the world? We've got many different societies, many different systems, many different cultures. Where would you point to identify, highlight this element, that element, or the other element of what you mean by individual collectivism to help us get a glimpse into what that looks like, how it works?
This is something people ask a lot of. And I would say, unfortunately, thanks to the rise of neoliberalism, it doesn't really exist on the planet anymore. There are glimpses of it.
For those of us not quite familiar, unpack the term neoliberalism. What exactly is neoliberalism?
So neoliberalism is the economic regime of free markets, open capital flows, low tax, low regulation environments that has come to dominate pretty much every economy on the planet since about 1975. It was a product of what was called the Chicago School, with Milton Friedman, who's still alive, and it has become, through the World Bank and the IMF, it has become the default mode for any developing country, and it has started to become the default mode for even developed countries. However, in some sectors, in some areas, you can see glimpses of what I would call individual collectivism. The way that property can't be passed on in China to avoid concentration of land and wealth is an example of a collectivist policy that helps individuals maintain their ability to access housing. Looking to the United States, Social Security. Individuals pay in for the collective good of not having poor old people eating dog food. In Europe, in Scandinavia, you have this underlying social safety net that is meant to catch you when you fall. So it's things like having a strong union, having paid maternity leave, having mandatory paid time off, which we don't even have in this country. These sorts of things. Those are things that help individuals, but it also makes their collective society stronger because they don't have millions of people living in precarious situations. Whereas in this country, we have a solid third of society that, if things were to go wrong, would be homeless tomorrow. And we saw during the pandemic, we literally had to pay $5 trillion to prevent 2/3 of the country from being homeless. So
let's look at one trend in America, and then just sort of, because I'm seeking to really understand everything you're saying and come up with a mental vision. The trend towards the gig economy, right? Because when you mention Scandinavian, our guests, our audience knows I used to live in Sweden. My formative years were in Sweden, and some of them, and it gave me that ability to look differently at American society and our capitalist system from an early age. And I lived in Germany for 10 years as an adult. I got to see what, that kind of a socialist state is and isn't, right? This, 6 weeks of paid vacation, paternity leave, maternity leave, child care for all workers. These kinds of programs, they're relatively expensive. They require a lot of regulation, and they require a really well-developed economy to make it work and sustain it. Here in America, we went sort of in the other direction with the gig economy, right? Where people had, and maybe it's this individualistic and this belief that I can make it, I can do better out there on my own. So the mentality is also feeding this and making it possible. But it's the opposite direction of what you're describing, right? The gig economy. You're out there with no safety net. You're having to do it all. You either do or don't have insurance. And if you get sick and you can't work, there's no safety net at all. Just discuss that. That's going in the opposite wrong direction then, if you will. But many, millions of Americans thought it was a good thing.
Well, yes. And that was mostly boomer greed. Was the reason why we thought that was a good idea. And because it is the gig economy. I wrote an article a while ago called How I Predicted the Gig Economy. And the reason we went in that direction was to save on labor costs by corporations. Because when you employ someone, we have enough labor regulations in this country that it adds on significant expenses to employing someone. So you have their salary plus all the stuff you have to pay for unemployment, all the insurance, all this type of thing. The gig economy really was a manifestation of corporations being able to save money on labor costs. Now, when we normally think of the gig economy, we think of Uber and DoorDash and all this type of thing, but it's actually more insidious than that. Unfortunately, it also is things like chickens. In my first book, What the Hell is Going On, I talked about how Tyson Chicken figured out the biggest expense they had was the raising of the chickens, so they started to hire farmers as independent contractors to raise the chickens for them to their specifications using their feed. It's the fastest way to go bankrupt in the country. They will get you in debt $250,000, they will barely pay you for the chicken, and you will end up owing them tens of thousands of dollars. And growing up in Northwest Arkansas, I saw that cycle repeat itself a lot.
Well, I mean, it's very similar. It's very similar,
yeah.
really, to the McDonald's and their franchise, right? They're not in the business of McDonald's as a corporation is not in the business of selling hamburgers. They're in the business of selling you a franchise to their business. They're in the business of owning the real estate, which you need to operate the business, and so that's a way to massively scale your corporate.
Yes, and that's true for most franchises. It's very hard for franchisees to make any meaningful money in a lot of those businesses because of all the stuff that they're required to pay for and mandatory rebrands and all this type of thing, and deals and stuff that they're required to take. It gets a mess. And so the gig economy is that comes from the same place. That comes from the same impetus of let's get rid of the cost centers, offload them onto other people, outsource it, make it someone else's problem so that the big co can save money. And that is that's kind of what we've done throughout the entire economy, is we have basically shoved off the costs of being an employee and working for someone off onto the employees themselves. This is particularly true in training and education. In another day and time, there was this thing called, and I know this is going to sound weird, on-the-job training. They actually paid you to learn how to work there. That hasn't existed since I've been in the workforce. Now they want you to show up already knowing every single thing, all of their systems. Well, it's the same thing, because rather than take on, and airlines do this with shoving off pilots onto the regional carrier so they don't have to deal with that or pay for their training or anything like that. And they can only hire those who have 5 to 10 years of training with the number of hours for the actual for the actual airline. It's throughout the economy, every industry. We're just constant. And so what has happened is working people end up being the last ones holding the bag who can't move it off to anywhere, end up with the expense of having to make themselves, quote unquote, and here's a buzz phrase, word you'll hear a lot, competitive in the marketplace.
Right. So we're going to go to commercial break. I've got a thought of where we can pick this up when we come back. We'll be right back. We're going to go to a commercial break, and we'll continue with with the topic here of Cameron Cowan and getting deeply into individual collectivism. Please stay with us.
We have arrived at a critical juncture socially, economically, and environmentally, where only innovative methods and ideas will generate the necessary changes your business requires. The holistic industry has a massive worldwide market with $4.3 trillion in revenue, growing by over 10% annually. Still, nobody can become an expert and thrive in the wellness and sustainable industry without the appropriate experience and wisdom. In The Business of Wellness, an entrepreneur's guide for growth and purpose, Sebastian Hilbert presents a step-by-step process that encourages you to tap into what you truly love and refocus that passion for achieving your wellness business goals and making a lasting, positive impact on the world. Get ready to step into who you are meant to be and cultivate the courage to take your business to the next level by securing your copy of The Business of Wellness at soupllc.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Wade Franson. We're here today with Cameron Cowan, who is talking about collective individualism. Right before the break, I had a little bit of a thought around where to go next in the interview. So, Cameron, I think when you were talking to Dan earlier, you were talking about a model in which a corporation would pay more would take use the assets and the resources of the company to pay out its employees more. How do you feel about the idea of employee stock ownership, right? Owning a share of that business, is that not a solution to all this? And we'll get into a model. Well, let me go into an example though, and how this has played out in the American economy, right? So years ago now, United Airlines became an employee-owned company, right? And they swapped, I don't know all the details, but they swapped out the pension fund for the employees and gave them stock instead. And this was supposed to be a good thing. But in terms of being competitive, the company wasn't, and they were actually trending towards bankruptcy. So one way of solving this massive liability of the pension fund that was underfunded and that they would have to pay out to the employees, they got the employees to agree, and the unions, whatever, to agree to take ownership of the company instead. And then they declared some kind of bankruptcy, if I have it right. I should have researched this right before. So, but isn't ownership an important piece of all this, right? Whether it's the Chinese land model that you mentioned, where the land can't be aggregated into the ownership or the hands of others, it has to remain distributed. How do we fix it? How do we really have large corporations that are sustainable over time? Because I'm not having lived in Germany, understanding what's going on in Sweden, I'm not sure that as a global economic model that they've got it all figured out with just the taxation piece.
Well, yes, let's criticize Europe, because in this country, Europe oftentimes gets held up as this sort of economic ideal because things here are so bad. Let's criticize Europe. Let's talk about France's 27% youth unemployment rate.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Let's talk about Italy. It's so dire for young people in Italy. They're working overseas. Ireland, their greatest export is their people, because their young people have no opportunity. They also end up working overseas. A lot of them come here to the United States. A lot of them go into the continent because of the European Union. It's a mess.
Right.
So
Thank you.
that there's a lot about Europe to criticize. Also, try starting a business in France. It'll take
Amen.
you 6 months to get a telephone line. A telephone line, okay? In fact, they were starting a tech thing in the Loire Valley, and they were talking about how efficient they were being because they could get a telephone installed in 3 weeks. And I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what? 3
Right.
Yeah. So
If,
I mean,
if it's not in the summer when everyone has their 8 weeks vacation.
yeah, and in France, don't even bother doing anything during the month of August. The
Right.
country is closed.
Right.
So and so there's a lot about that model that is not necessarily so great. The only reason Germany was able to pull off the industrial miracle it had is because Gerhard Schroeder broke the back of the trade unions because they were driving the country into the ground.
Right.
I mean, literally with strikes and all this stuff, it was getting real bad in the late 80s, early 90s in Germany. And so there's a lot to complain about. And the high tax environment is not necessarily great for business. It's not necessarily great for individuals when it comes to passing wealth in between families. Estate taxes can be absolutely brutally crushing. When Picasso died, the French government, the tax for his children was going to be so high. The French government compromised and said, if you give us all the art, we'll let you keep the cash. And so they ended up donating 300 incredibly valuable works of art to the nation of France to pay the tax, and they kept his money because he's one of the very few artists that actually got wealthy in his lifetime. So there's definitely some issues and some things with that. When it comes to employee ownership and stocks and all this type of thing, Walmart is another company that very famously keeps their stock price low so that employees can buy into the company and own part of Walmart. You have never heard of a ordinary person working at Walmart for 20 or 30 years being able to cash that out and end up doing very well for themselves and retiring on that alone. Why have you never heard of that? Because ultimately, it doesn't really work that well. Because here's the problem. As a worker, you are never going to have the at-scale buying power of a pension fund, an institution, a hedge fund, any of these large funds that can come in and do some, and can move a stock price simply by making purchases. Or like things like what Warren Buffett does with Berkshire Hathaway. They move markets so badly that they have to do all their purchases in a very specific way to
Right.
get the price that they want, because their purchases will literally cause markets to move. So if the worker being on their own as an individual and trying to compete against these massive forces on their own, it's just not possible. That's why I say collectivism for working people is our superpower, but it's got a hitch. It only works when we all use it together. We can't, the powers don't work if we do it on our own. The powers only work when we do it together, which is why when it comes to something like retirement, privatizing that was the worst idea ever. Half of boomers have nothing in retirement. They are going to end up retiring into poverty. And that's going to end up costing the rest of us a lot of money. If we just simply took everybody's 401k and nationalized it, Social Security would be fully funded for 200 years. I mean, this is the stuff where trying to make everything an individual responsibility leaves those on the top end doing very well and those on the bottom end with not enough, or if they got anything at all. And so when
Right.
it comes to
Warren
a lot
Buffett,
of this, let's make capitalism work for you, I'm suspicious because we've had enough time to look at this and be like, that doesn't really work out for the regular working person.
Well, I think it was Warren Buffett who said trickle-down economics works, but the rich have found a way to plug the leaks.
Yes.
Right. So to make sure that it stays with them, and it is greed, right? And it's the lack of it's actually the lack of a collective understanding and purpose. You've talked about the echo chambers, the news cycles, the false dichotomies that keep us separated into warring camps. But even if there weren't warring camps, we might have a greater common collective view, but that doesn't mean that we would know what to do with it or how to structure it, because you mentioned earlier the world is very complex.
Well, yes, and Occupy definitely was not an endorsement of the power of concerted collective action. You had a lot of people very angry. You did not have the necessary individual intellectual background to give that teeth, and you did not have a specific set of policies that everyone could subscribe to and demand from government or begin to get political action going. Now, very fortunately, the popularity of people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and the idea of the 99% and democratic socialism was made popular by Occupy, and that has begun to affect American elections, lo these 10, 12 years on from the Occupy movement. And I've written about this in a post called Occupy Memories, where I talk about the long tail effects of the Occupy movement. It's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing. You do have to have a very specific program. You do have to have a very specific set of a very specific view of the world and the economy and how to fix and change it. There will be unintended consequences. There always are. But that's something where I think and here's where individualism creeps back in, because in order for collective action and policy to be successful, you need to find out what individuals need to thrive. So if you're designing a welfare program, if you're designing childcare, all this type of thing, you need programs that are well funded enough to be supple and flexible enough to help people and meet people where they are. And that's one of the flaws of the old welfare system as we had it in the 20th century. It was very top down. It was very brutal. It was very restrictive. It did not respond to the real needs of people. And a lot of people were hurt and damaged. The entire Black community really was damaged by these programs not being mindful of individuals. That's why we need both.
Well, an adequate representation, right? So, you've got the large corporate money interests. You also have the lobbyists, right? You have the self-serving public servants who don't serve the public at all. You really have rampant materialism in religious terms. You have greed, you have covetousness, right? Desiring the things that other people have in this never-ending ramp up of, it started with just keeping up with the Joneses, right? As the old school way of saying it. But the expectations of everybody having to have the life of a king, and the expectations of what they could and should have through all that hard work, right? Leads
it's
to
a
people.
Very different thing when hard work pays, when a lot of the people, especially that I talked to in developing America's Lost Generation and all this type of thing, a lot of these people, they're not looking at living hot super high on the hog. They're not trying to that. They would like their hard work and their job, one job, not two or three, to pay them enough in order to continue to exist in this country. And we faced this before after World War II, when they got rid of all the price controls and wage controls that existed during the war. The price of living in this country went out of control till 1951. And the price of everything skyrocketed. There were shortages from years of rationing. It was a mess. And it took what we talked about in the previous segment, that great engine of economic progress, to kind of unwind that. But it was still quite an issue, and the rising cost of living and housing shortage. A lot of the stuff that we're facing now is very similar to what we were facing between about 1946 and 1951. And so you have to kind of understand all of that and create a system in which hard work pays off for people. But that means you have to pay people, not shareholders. You have to invest in people and productive expansion rather than securitization, rather than making money with money, which is what half of Wall Street does now. They don't invest in companies that make cars and airplanes and light bulbs and televisions. No, they buy mortgage-backed securities, for example, and they make money from nothing. That economic activity produces nothing that helps anyone other than the bank who charged the fee to make the market for the MBS. So if you're a shareholder at Goldman Sachs, bravo. If you're literally anybody else in the country, you've just had trillions change hands and you haven't seen a dime of it.
Yep. I'm going to go ahead and bring in Dan again to join us
let's
here.
Bring Dan back.
From our neighbor up north in Canada, where they have, of course, the perfect balance of individual collectivism. I don't know if it was out of courtesy and consideration that you were outlining the woes and the ills of Europe while leaving Canada unscathed. Dan, how are things up there up north in terms of the economic benefits of collective individualism or individual collectivism?
I think pretty good. I mean, I think one of the striking things that I've gleaned from this particular conversation with Cameron is that you want to have a population that has the bare necessities provided, right? Like the necessities so that if you have a hospital issue or you have something unexpected, that it doesn't leave you completely bereft, bankrupt, and living under a bridge, right? And there is a misconception. I think there's part misconception, part truth in this, but the medical systems in comparing, the American versus the Canadian medical systems. Never have I been left with the impression that anything that happens to me as a result of going to a hospital would result in an enormous bill that would bankrupt me and my family. It's just not even a possibility. It doesn't happen. And it's bizarre to me that would happen in the wealthiest country in the world. It's bizarre. It's something that maybe we as Canadians are proud of. Now, I know it's not perfect, but there was a politician by the name of Tommy Douglas that, really, I think it was at the right time in history introduced this type of thing, and it's really a gift.
Is this kind of what you're talking about here, Dan? Socialism for the necessities, markets for the Nikes in video games. Obviously, more of a soundbite than a well thought out policy. But nonetheless, what is the minimum standard, right? Because in individual collectivism, as you're outlining it, Cameron, and your emphasis on hard work, people need to be motivated and incented, right? The taking away every possible stress and not having a situation in which people sort of have to work for something. Is that first of all, I don't know that it's possible. I mean, maybe we get there if we started making good decisions. Maybe we'd be there hundreds of years from now for everybody on the planet. I mean, it would literally take how many generations for that to actually be realized? But along the path to get there, we still need this balance of and you've talked about it in different ways with many of the examples you've used, Cameron, of incentive being properly incentivized, right? Both the carrot and the stick. If you know what that analogy means.
Yes, I mean, systems matter a great deal. Humans are deeply responsive to systems. One philosopher that was very good at this, and I talk about this in my TED Talk, is Gaston Bachelard. And he, in his book, The Poetics of Space, he talks about how living, like the system of living in huts and shelter, and how it changes how we experience and move through the world. The concept of indoors and outdoors. He also talks about how in moving through space, you'll see worn paths, like on a college campus, you'll see a worn path across the field because that's the shortest distance to get to where people want to go. And the smart college tears up the sidewalk where they put it, and they put it over there. Our brains naturally, unconsciously, very quickly, we're brilliant at this, find those short routes to places. We're apex predators. We're very good at figuring out how to get the maximum result from the least amount of output effort. Our brains need so many calories to operate because our brains are so large. We really have to economize how we spend energy elsewhere in our body. And Bachelard talks about that quite extensively. And so there, you have to, when you look at these systems, you have to think about it in that way.
I want to share a quick example of how that works for our audience. We have these beautiful stone steps that kind of lead up, but they're beautiful in a rustic way, right? They're like laid blocks. But in America, in Western society now, we have codes, we have building codes, right? All the stairs have to be exactly the same height and exactly the same depth, right? And our brains figure this out without ever thinking about it, right? So as people move from our house to our backyard and they go up these steps, every time we have an event like we had one just this weekend, somebody trips on those steps, falls, cuts themselves on the natural stone. Why does this happen? Because they're having fun. They're not thinking about going up their steps. They're letting their motor memory take over, their muscle memory. Their body knows exactly what a stair is, because a stair is always exactly the same, because we have regulations that enforce that it must always be the same. So people are tripping over this because they're not thinking about it at all. In past years, you didn't have everything so uniform. You had to pay attention to going up and down the stairs. You didn't let your machine motor memory take over. This is just one little example of the routines as we evolve and keep ratcheting up expectations and the complex functioning of society. To your point about people being adaptive to systems and responding to systems.
And that is, and when we look at economic systems and all this type of thing, and you want to know, why people do what they do, an economic model, to kind of bring us circled back to the beginning, an economic model will say, oh, people will go find the cheapest, gas price in town. They won't. And I'll tell you why. Because it takes too much gas to drive there for the savings that you would have. And people figure that out very naturally pretty early on in their driving career. And so as me and my dad talking about this one time, I said, I don't go for the cheapest gas price in town. I go for the cheapest gas price on my route to work. I pass 7 gas stations. At the time I was working in Ballard and living in Northgate. I passed 7 gas stations on my way to work. Whoever has the lowest price is going to get my business. And also sometimes, because I worked another job, I always stopped at 7-Eleven regardless of the price, because that's where I got my coffee and my donut on my way to work. And it was one-stop shopping. So I could go in, 20 in the gas tank, donut, coffee, out the door, I'm on my way to work. So at that point, I didn't care about the gas price. Why is that? Because the coffee and the donut were more important. So but
Yeah.
Economic models don't take that into account. Why does Cameron go to that 7-Eleven with the higher gas price? Because he wants his coffee and his donut, damn it. And so this is the type of thing that, like, economic models are very bad at measuring. And when we have these conversations, we don't think about those because they're human things. And each one of us has them. Each one of us does a thing. I have another autistic friend who's very, very good at getting large corporations to give him free stuff. I'm talking phones, car parts, all sorts of stuff. He knows how to game bureaucracy like no one else. And he's a tall, white, straight man, so they're already ready to give him whatever he wants. It's very helpful. And he is just so, like, if he needs a new cell phone, he has got it down to a science of how to destroy his phone in such a way that they'll send him a new one because the model isn't made anymore. He has figured out how to game the system. Economics doesn't measure any of this stuff at all. This never, you will read 10 economic textbooks and no one will ever talk about this. But if you want to understand why things happen the way they do, or why people do what they do, that's what you have to start going and looking at. And that's one of the points of individual collectivism. And if you want a non-American example, I'll give you one. Under the old Soviet system, the central planning agency was called Gosplan.
Right.
And someone observed that only 2,000 people worked at Gosplan, but the cafeteria sat 4,000. Now, why was that? Because every leader of every industry throughout the entire Soviet Union would come to Gosplan to lobby the planners to get special preferences for their industry. They'd figured out how to game the system. So there were so many people coming to meet with people at Gosplan that without really realizing what they were doing, they expanded the cafeteria to enable the ability for industry leaders to lobby Gosplan to get preferences for their industry. If you want to understand how the world actually works and why things happen the way they do, that's the stuff you have to go look at.
Yep, I thought it was appropriate to throw this comment in here at this moment. Nationalize natural resources. So I personally am not a big fan of nationalization because I don't believe, and this gets to the heart and core of maybe the resistance to what some may understand when you use the term individual collectivism. I don't believe that governments are necessarily evolved enough at this point to manage this well. That's one of the strains in American life. So there's the individualism, but there's also the reticence to give over the control. Using the Gosplan example and the Soviet Union as an example, and other societies which have had strong autocratic governments. They weren't at all responsive to the will of the people. They didn't necessarily at all take the concerns of the people into account, or perhaps they weren't capable of doing it with the level of science or consciousness available to them at the time. So nationalizing everything and giving control to the government, has often been a recipe for absolute human misery.
Yeah.
But that also depends on who's in control of the government and why. Our government is ran by major corporations for their benefit. Please see my essay, How We the People Became We the Corporation, What the Hell is Going On? New edition out this year. That depends on who's in charge of your government. If we the people, if we didn't have Citizens United in the United States, and corporate donations weren't free speech, thank you, Supreme Court, if we pulled that money out of politics, if we had publicly funded elections, and our representatives spent time representing us rather than spending the bulk of their time raising money for political parties, which is what they do now, they don't pass any legislation anymore, they spend time raising money to stay in office, that would be a very different conversation over who's controlling what. When you look at nationalization of resources, there's some excellent examples where that has worked well. One is oil in Norway. The other one in this country is agriculture. If you have never met a more centrally planned, government-mandated, brokered, price-controlled system than agriculture in this country. Yep. The Department of Agriculture makes Gosplan look lazy. In terms of they will pay a farmer to dump 80 million gallons of milk down a river to keep the price of milk just right. Eggs, destroy 50,000 eggs to keep the price of eggs just. I mean, the Department of Agriculture will go to communist levels of market manipulation to keep commodity prices relatively stable in agriculture.
And one could theorize. I haven't looked into it in terms of timing and actual events, but that this has become a method used by those in power to stay in power by keeping the people happy and keeping inflation in check in those things that matter to those people who are not able to afford much else than being able to feed themselves and put food on the table. But those prices have to be kept low for enough of those people so that we don't have revolt and riot.
I mean, I think there is a certain amount of that, especially when you hear at some of the things that people say at Davos. I would like to go to Davos one of these years. I've
I've been
always
there.
felt
I
like
lived in Switzerland briefly, but I was not a member of
yes,
the club that was meeting at Davos.
yes, I'm desperate to get in. I'll say in full disclosure, desperate to get into that world. Um, World Economic Forum, here I come. Club of Rome, here I come. And so when it comes to some of they say, hey, like inequality is getting to be a problem, and we should do something about that because the pitchforks are coming. We kind of know how this ends, and
The
history is
peasants
not
are
kind.
revolting, right?
Right, and I agree with you. I think that was certainly under Alan Greenspan from 1986 to 2008. That definitely was the
Well,
policy.
and
That was Alan
started out
Greenspan's
with good
whole
intentions,
thing.
right? Food security for our nation to make sure that we supported a healthy, robust agricultural industry across the nation so that food was readily and always available.
Of course, and a lot of those reforms came out of the Depression when commodity prices had crashed and farmers got wiped
Right.
out and all. And this is obviously before big ag was a thing, so it was
Right.
real
Yep.
families that were getting wiped out by all of this. Certainly, and I think a lot of the reason agriculture persists in this country the way it does is because even big ag realizes that volatile commodity prices is in no one's best interest, and so they're content to let the Department of Agriculture fundamentally basically centrally plan farming in this country in order to maintain their own profit margins. They're not stupid. And so, for them, government regulation works in their favor. There's a lot of other areas where it would be nice to have that level of government involvement. Housing, for example.
Oh, I
In the United
can't.
States,
Oh.
healthcare, things like that. I mean, having with Britain, council housing was something. Margaret Thatcher ruined council housing by letting people buy council houses. The idea of having your local area have certain houses that are set aside for poor people who can't afford housing or young people who need a starter home or something like that is probably one of the most brilliant housing schemes ever. Thatcher kind of ruined it, but it's one of the most brilliant things ever. There's certain sectors where having more government involvement than less in order to stabilize a price, in order to keep something available to people, something like that can be a thing. Dan's blown a fuse over here because I've threatened to nationalize housing. So we'll hear from Dan on that.
Well, look, I just every time there's regulations, there's always strings attached. And I know as an entrepreneur, I know as somebody that spent a lot of time as an entrepreneur working in the architectural field, working with builders. I have one particular builder friend that has amassed a $10 million fortune with his bare hands. He's a Polish immigrant. And here we go, eye
We
rolling,
love to
not
see
from
it.
you guys, but like, the individual stories don't define a truth. I don't know why I froze there, but anyways, it's an anecdote. Okay, so great. He knows one person that's done this. It doesn't mean anything in terms of a statistical average or anything like that, right? But when I worked with my friend who has built this $10 million fortune, we are on the Pacific coast of Canada in the province of British Columbia. Now, I've seen over the last 10 to 15 years more and more power shift to the BC Housing Corporation. Okay, it's actually a government-run housing corporation, so that it's supposed to help with affordable housing. But what's happening is that it's becoming more and more of a problem, but you have the people who have the factories, have the ability to do it. He can't get any business from them. They control so much of the regulation. I remember him trying to submit for to participate in these programs. The top questions they were asking him are, what is your Indigenous hiring policy? What are your thoughts on LGBTQ? All of these political things that have absolutely nothing to do with building a home. I care how you swing a hammer. I care how you can line up and actually, produce your trade. I do not give a shit about these political issues. I give a shit about them, but not for this. I'm not hiring based off of your indigenous heritage. And I'm not going to be put at the bottom of the list because I don't have those qualifications. I don't meet what your political ideology is trying to promote. This is government overreach. This is restrictions. These restrictions come with strings, and those strings control government. And then people learn, as you guys have both pointed out, how to control the system. They control a system that is anchored in politics, not in actually how to build a house. This frustrates me to no end because it's complete bullshit. And I see this as an extenuation of all the new liberal order that's coming down from a top-down approach. And it's not this like everything's going to be taken care of and all we need to do is reallocate the wealth. I personally think we're headed for tough times. And we need to teach people how to be resilient from the bottom up. And what does that mean? Are there going to be people at the top making money? Yes. But everybody's out for a power grab and everybody's wanting to get there for free. And you know what? I'm not afraid of hard work in any regime. And we live in the most prosperous countries on the planet. I can make it, and so can a lot of people. They need to do things like hard work, focus. And you know what? Life is tough. Suck it up. Keep working. You'll get there. And if you don't, keep working. That's the way it is.
I mean, yes, okay. I hear this. I hear this a lot. I would like to take a recording of that speech and let's walk down to an American restaurant called the Waffle House, where people are paid whatever the minimum wage in the area is, plus tips that are crappy. And if they're lucky, they have full-time hours, but they probably don't. They probably have part-time hours, which means they're probably working a second job. I would like to show that to the single mom with a kid, maybe two, who's working at the Waffle House and at Walmart or somewhere else, and who cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment in this country. Who every time the gas price goes up, that's whether, it's where she's picking whether her kids are going to eat or she's going to eat tonight. And that means her kids will eat and she won't. And I've had single mom friends who I have brought them food. When I used to work in food, I would take our leftovers and bring them food, because if I didn't bring them food, they weren't going to eat that night because they'll make sure their kids eat before they will. And that goes on in this country. Again, we don't track this. We don't talk about it. We don't tell this story. That's why I try to tell this. It's very, very hard to go up to somebody and say, you can make it just work a little bit harder. When the reality is, if we were a civilized country and our minimum wage had been raised since 2009, which it hasn't been in this country, and was adjusted for inflation, that single mom wouldn't need to work two jobs. If we disallowed companies from giving just enough hours to avoid having benefits, which is gaming the system, we could stop that we could make sure that if you're going to hire somebody, you actually give them enough hours to live because you've hired them. You have the same problem in Britain with 0-hour contracts. Companies will hire people with no impetus to ever give people hours. So you have people that have jobs that it's like, yeah, I have a job, but I don't get any hours, so I don't get any money. Therefore, I can't live. These are the problems and the difficulties that we have to solve. And just simply working harder solves none of the underlying systemic issues that cause this to be the case.
Thank you. Let me jump in here and say, I was wondering, Cameron, how you were going to respond to Dan, and I really like your response. I want to highlight another layer of the complexity here, though, and that is that the Waffle House owner, whether it's a franchise or whether it's an individual one, that person himself is not Warren Buffett, right? He's the owner of a restaurant. But likely, if that restaurant even exists after COVID, right? Somehow he managed to survive. Maybe he got government help. As a business owner, it's not only difficult, but probably impossible to make your business work by paying that living wage. So I love your answer because it is a systemic problem, but there are systems within systems within systems. and pointing at any one, point, any one cog in that wheel. You can't increase one cog, the whole system breaks, or that cog breaks.
No, I mean,
right?
Let's be clear. If we're going to, and I live in Seattle, where we were the first in the nation to do this. We bumped up the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and everyone said every restaurant will close, every fast food place will close, grocery stores will close. It's going to be Armageddon. By the way, none of those things happened.
No, I agree. No, wait, I'm not.
Literally had a breakfast burrito from a shop this morning. We still have restaurants here. Like,
No, this is exactly what I was saying. You can't tell that one restaurant owner to do it. You must make everybody do it. You follow me?
No, and that's why I'm saying underlying systemic issues.
I understood.
You cannot, and this is why, yes, telling the individual restaurant owner, you should pay your employees more. Well, no, if I raise my prices to do that, I will go out of business. Everyone will go next door. But when we fix the system and attempt to, as best we can,
so
raise all boats,
this is where I was going. So the next statement I was going to make is that we as human beings must realize that, look, somebody's working in that restaurant. It used to be like maybe that was the job that you had during high school, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And therefore you did not.
That's no longer the reality. It hasn't been for years.
Right. Therefore you did not need a living wage. And therefore it was kind of okay, because I was totally fine with my daughter, who's 14, making $8 an hour and living at home. Right. And I'm providing her, her room, her car, if she has a car, or her bicycle, you follow me, whatever. I'm the one providing it. So it's okay. But this is the idea of a living wage, right? We as human beings must dig in and say, we can't allow that somebody else is expected to serve me, but that same person who is now serving me doesn't deserve to earn enough money to live. However, not every job should necessarily provide a full middle class income for a family.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
That also gets into if people. I mean, if you want,
but wait, let me finish.
Exist in our society.
Let me finish. So, therefore, if a mother with 3 children is working at the restaurant but can't afford to provide for herself and her 3 children, she needs help, not necessarily. In other words, not every job could be mandated to pay enough to feed a full family. You follow me? There are different. It's a challenge. It's a challenge.
I will say this. So in our comment section, there's a commenter who is a Christian communist. Didn't know that existed, but I am living for these comments because I'm about to use labor theory of value. Which I'm sure that they will enjoy. When you talk about labor theory of value, and you talk about, if someone is laboring and is working and is creating something that has inherent value and deserves to be compensated, to say, okay, because you work at McDonald's on the prep line, you're going to not be middle class. That's okay, depending on how you define middle class. But just because you work on the food line at McDonald's does not mean you shouldn't have access to childcare. You shouldn't have access to healthcare. You shouldn't have access to enough money to actually be able to afford housing and have your wages increasing according to inflation over time. And by the way, there's already countries where this exists. This is true in Australia because their minimum wage is tied to their CPI. This is true in Denmark. Where their minimum wage is also tied to CPI. This is already true in places where this can exist. And here's the advantage. Poor working class people spend money. The wealthy don't. The wealthy hang on to it. I spend money. My parents sit on money and don't do a damn thing with it. If you give the working class money, guess what? The wealthy will get most of it anyway. Old Roy Rogers quote.
That's the problem.
Things
That's
will
not-
cycle.
yeah.
This is why it's important to have money cycling
Right.
through the economy, is because eventually, here's the thing: if I'm paying the people at Waffle House more, this is really good for Walmart share prices. Why is that? Because they'll go across the parking lot and buy the things they need from Walmart. As a Walmart shareholder, I'm all about it.
Which
When
is
do
why
we get started?
which is why we need wealth and asset-based taxation versus income taxation. But then there are a whole bunch of systemic issues with that as well. You work your whole
Yes.
life, you manage to own your house. Because you now have your house, you're foreclosed on it because you can't afford to pay the taxes as you decline.
Well,
Right, so-
and what wealth taxes, Elizabeth Warren proposed a wealth tax a couple years ago, and I was against it, and people are kind of like, this is your thing. I'm like, the data doesn't bear out. Sweden tried a wealth tax. They tried it for 3 years. It was a complete disaster, and they repealed it. Because every wealthy person in Sweden found every way to get out of paying it. They got no money out of it. It created a legal disaster. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. They gave up.
Yep.
France kind of has that, but only in inheritance, because they couldn't figure it out either. And if the tax and spend French and Swedes can't figure it out,
Well,
we have no hope in America. America's wealthy are a lot more crafty. They'll find every way out of it. So we need to do it a different way.
the best laid plans
That's
of mice.
why I love a Wall Street transaction tax.
Well, the best laid plans of mice and men gang after Galay, right? In other words, they will figure out a way around it no matter how well you plan, because that's the individual incentive. So how do we get people to think collectively? How do we get people to want to act collectively? We're not going to try to answer that question. I don't want an answer because we're out of time, but we're going to go more in that direction on this show, Created in the Image of God, the role in religion in society. What I want to do right now is real quick play a clip for the show that we're going to have next week. So first of all, Cameron, I want to thank you for being on the show. I hope some of the people, we need to get a video for your books. We need to get a QR code for your site. We can also just put something in the chat here. If you want to type something in the private chat, I can stick it in the public chat so that it's there for posterity and everyone to see. So, where people can find you and whatnot. But I want to play this clip right now. So, when I was on Cameron's show recently, we talked about my experience at Countrywide. And the fact that the CEO of Countrywide was on the cover of Time magazine as the #1 cause of the economic meltdown. There you are in the chat, Cameron.
Thank you.
So this also led to Dan getting me in touch with Steve Keen, who's a recognized, what's the term, a type of economist. Perfect. Dan,
Post-Keynesian. I was
post-Keynesian. No, there's another. It's not post-Keynesian. There's another term for the kind of economist, non-heterodox. Right? Is that it?
Oh yeah. And he's a real rebel.
Right.
In his earlier years, he'd go in a biker jacket.
Brilliant man. I'm just going to play a quick
really
2-minute clip of a section of the interview that I did with Steve Keen recently. We're going to have more of this on next week's show, diving deeper into this topic. So let me just play this clip real quick, and we'll be back then and wrap up.
So, Steve, are you familiar with the Baha'i faith at all?
Yes, I am. It's one of the, I've started saying, it's one of the few religions that I have some respect for.
Well, I'm a Baha'i. So that's why I say I'm in the center, not conservative. However, I'm a former fundamentalist Christian minister. And I was part of the strategic planning community as Countrywide grew from 30 to 60,000 employees. You're familiar with Countrywide, I assume, and its CEO, Angela Mazzillo.
Yeah, I mean, I've followed this from a distance. It's one of those amusing examples of America's capacity to scam its people. And so Countrywide is my experience as an observer of that rather than, thankfully, somebody who experienced it firsthand.
Because of what I was doing, I was in the jet stream within Countrywide of the other leaders who were planning for the growth of their business units, which included wholesale lending. You're familiar with what that is. Subprime lending, you're familiar with what that is. And then CFC Bank, right? So Countrywide established itself as a bank. And this was fascinating because the way they did it was, and by the way, they did it because they wanted the deposits to help continue to just suck in capital to fund the wholesale lending and whatnot. And this was also at the time where they were building a trading floor underneath the headquarters in Calabasas, where they're actually now trading in the securities, the sausage that they were creating, right? Are you familiar, for example, with the fact that Angela Mazzillo was on the Time magazine cover January 2009 as the #1 cause of the economic meltdown?
Okay, yeah.
Right, January 2009. So I looked at that cover and I thought, well, it could have been any one of a number of other individuals whom you might mention now. But I thought fair enough because I knew enough about what was going on in there, which is what I'm about to unpack.
So
Next
Dan,
week.
Dan pulled that clip together from a prior interview. Next week, we're going to dive a little bit more into that interview with Steve Keen. 2 weeks from now, we'll be back with Cameron talking about the Enlightenment and capitalism. What we're doing here is laying the groundwork to dive into the question, how can we have a change of heart, a change of mind, and a change of behavior that will lead us to think more in a systematic way? There also the first commandment in the Bible is dress and keep the garden. The second commandment is be fruitful and multiply. The second commandment is the only one we've ever followed consistently as a species, and we've become the most invasive species the world has ever known. We haven't dressed and kept the garden. Following quickly on that, be fruitful and multiply. That commandment was broken when, in the story, in the Garden of Eden, the firstborn child of Adam and Eve killed the other son, which is subtraction, not multiplication, right? Be fruitful and multiply. That's when death, murder, and mayhem entered in. Why? Through greed and jealousy. The point is, we want to look at some of these stories and look at what is the role of religion in society? How can we become a species that does dress and keep the garden and also becomes our brother's keeper, right? What was it that God asked Cain? Where is your brother, right? And Cain said, what am I, my brother's keeper? Well, the answer is yes, we are our brother's keeper. This individual collectivism, which Cameron is talking about, is how we collectively care for one another, how we collectively design systems that improve the quality of life for all of us, that fix these societal problems that we don't want to look at, that we don't want to fix. So, Cameron, thank you so much for raising our awareness, for bringing in so many different inputs into our thinking, so many different illustrations, so many facts and statistics and perspectives on this. We'll continue this discussion, as I've just mentioned, but what words of final parting thoughts for tonight on this subject of individual collectivism would you like to leave our audience with as we close up for the night?
When you see a problem like failing schools, houselessness, this type of thing, those are not individual failures, those are systemic failures. When someone is houseless, when a school is failing, when we see these problems, those are not just the people who are affected by its problem. It is our problem as a society. And until we start thinking of it in that frame, it makes those things very hard to solve.
Well said, succinctly stated. Cameron, thank you. Please do visit him. He has so much more to offer. How often is your podcast aired, Cameron?
The Cameron Journal podcast airs every Monday. We do an author interview every Monday, and the Cameron Journal News Hour airs live at 5 p.m. Pacific every Monday. So 2 episodes a week.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dan, thank you for kicking it off tonight, for introducing us to Cameron, and for participating. Everyone, have a great week. We'll see you next week, same time, same place.